The sound of the locks being changed still echoes in my ears. It was a gray Tuesday in October when I found myself standing on the sidewalk of my own home, holding only a small suitcase and the weight of 52 years of marriage that had just been thrown in the trash. "Grace, you have 2 hours to get your personal things," said Brenda, my sister-in-law, without even looking me in the eyes. She stood there, arms crossed, as if she were the new owner of the place. Richard made it very clear while he was alive that this house always belonged to the Williams family. My name is Grace Williams. I'm 73 years old, and for more than 5 decades, I was the devoted wife of Richard Williams. I cared for him during his long battle with cancer, held his hand when he passed just 3 weeks ago, and organized every detail of his funeral. I never imagined that at 73, I would find myself homeless, kicked out by people who barely visited my husband when he was alive. But they didn't know one thing, and that thing would change everything. Richard was always a discreet man, especially when it came to money and important papers. His family, Brenda, his younger son, Derek, and his sister Patricia, always believed they knew all his secrets. They always treated me like the wife who got lucky, marrying a successful man, as if I were just decoration in his life. During all these years, they saw me as the woman who took care of the house, prepared Sunday dinners, and smiled politely during visits. They never suspected that Richard and I shared much more than a last name. They never imagined that behind my cake recipes and conversations about gardening, there was a mind that Richard deeply respected. "Come on, Grace," Derek insisted, now with the house keys, dangling provocatively in his hand. "You've lived here long enough. Mom needs a place to live, and this house is too big for just one person." I looked at the house where I had built an entire life. The rose bushes I planted last spring were still blooming. The porch where Richard and I had coffee every morning still held our rocking chairs. Every brick, every window, every corner of that place told our story. But there was something they didn't know. Something Richard had entrusted to me just 2 months before he died, when he already sensed that his family would try to kick me out. I picked up my suitcase, walked to my old car, and before starting it, I turned to them one last time. "Are you sure you want to do this?" I asked calmly. Brenda let out a dry laugh. "Grace, dear, stop being dramatic. You're strong. You'll manage. Maybe it'll even be better for you to start over in a smaller place." If you're enjoying my story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because what happened next was something none of them could have imagined in their worst nightmares. But before I tell you how I turned their lives into a living hell, I need you to understand who these people were and why they thought they had the right to treat me like garbage. Block 2. The Williams family had always been masters of appearance. From the outside, they looked like the perfect American family. Successful, close-knit, respectable. But I had lived among them for over 50 years, and I knew the truth that lurked beneath their polished surface. You see, when you're the second wife, you learn to watch. You learn to listen. You develop a sixth sense for the undercurrents that run beneath polite dinner conversation and holiday gatherings. For decades, I had been the quiet observer, the one who poured the coffee and served the pie while they talked around me as if I were furniture. Brenda, Richard's younger sister, had always resented me. Not because I was a bad wife, but because I was a good one. She had married young to a man who left her bitter and divorced by 40, and seeing Richard and me happy together was like salt in an open wound. She spent decades dropping subtle comments about how some women just get lucky, as if love were a lottery ticket I'd won unfairly. I remember one Thanksgiving, maybe 15 years ago, when she made a comment that still stings. "Grace is so fortunate," she had said, cutting her turkey with surgical precision. "Some of us have to work for everything we get, while others just fall into comfortable situations." The way she said comfortable situations, like my marriage was a business transaction instead of a love story that had lasted decades. What Brenda never understood was that I had worked, not just at keeping house or making Richard comfortable, but at building something real with him. While she was busy being bitter about her own failed relationships, I was learning everything about the man I loved. His fears, his dreams, his business concerns, his family worries. Richard and I didn't just share a bed and a last name, we shared a life. Derek, Richard's son from his first marriage, was a different kind of poison. At 48, he had never held a steady job for more than 2 years. His solution to every problem was to call Daddy for money. Richard loved his son, but even he knew Derek was weak. "That boy has champagne taste on a beer budget," Richard used to say, shaking his head with disappointment. I had watched Derek's pattern for years. He would disappear for months, sometimes even a year, living his life and pretending his father didn't exist. Then, whenever money got tight or a business venture failed, he would reappear with that charming smile and a sob story. Richard never said no. It broke my heart to watch him hope, every single time, that this would be the moment Derek finally grew up. But I had been married to Richard long enough to see what Derek couldn't, or wouldn't. His father was disappointed. Not angry, not resentful, but deeply, quietly disappointed in the man his son had become. "I gave him every advantage," Richard once told me late at night, staring at the ceiling. "Private schools, college paid for, connections, second chances, third chances. But you can't give someone character grace. That has to come from within." Patricia, Richard's eldest sister, was perhaps the worst of them all. She was the family matriarch, the one who decided who belonged and who didn't. She had tolerated me for decades because Richard made it clear I wasn't going anywhere, but her cold smiles and backhanded compliments had always made it clear what she really thought of me. Patricia had this way of making me feel small without ever saying anything directly cruel. She would comment on my clothes, "Oh, Grace, that's such an interesting choice." Or my cooking, "This is delicious, though it's not quite how Mother used to make it." She had perfected the art of the poisoned compliment, the kind that left you feeling confused about whether you'd been insulted or praised. For years, I had absorbed these tiny cuts in silence. I told myself it didn't matter what they thought of me. I told myself that Richard's love was enough, that their approval wasn't something I needed. But the truth was, it hurt. It hurt to be treated like an outsider in my own family, to be reminded constantly that I wasn't born a Williams, that I had married into a club that would never fully accept me. What none of them understood was that Richard saw through their act completely. During his final months, when the cancer was eating away at his strength but sharpening his mind, he would lie in bed and tell me things that would have shocked them. "Grace," he said one evening in August, his voice barely above a whisper, "they think I'm a fool. They think I don't see Derek coming around more often now that I'm sick, or notice how Brenda suddenly wants to help with my finances. They think I don't hear Patricia on the phone, planning what she'll do with the inheritance." Those conversations in his final weeks revealed a side of Richard I had always sensed, but never seen so clearly. He was tired, not just from the cancer, but from pretending his family was something they weren't. He was tired of Derek's excuses, tired of Brenda's passive-aggressive comments, tired of Patricia's manipulations. I remember adjusting his pillows and asking, "What do you want to do about it?" His eyes, still sharp despite everything, met mine. "I want to protect you. They'll come for you the moment I'm gone, and they'll use my love for Derek against me. They expect me to leave everything to blood family, like you weren't family too." That conversation changed everything. Over the next few weeks, Richard made several trips to his lawyer's office. I drove him, there myself, waiting in the car while he handled what he called family business. I never asked what he was doing. Richard had always been private about legal matters, and I respected that. But I noticed things. The way he would come out of those appointments looking satisfied, almost peaceful. The way he started treating his family's visits differently. Still kind, still loving, but with a distance that hadn't been there before. It was as if he had made peace with something, had settled a debt in his own mind. 3 days before he died, he called me to his bedside and pressed something into my hand. It was a small key I'd never seen before. "Safety deposit box," he whispered. "First National Bank downtown. Box 247. Wait until after the funeral, Grace. Wait until they show their true colors. Then you'll know exactly what to do." Now, standing in that hotel room I'd rented with my credit card, I understood exactly what he meant. They had shown their true colors, all right. The way Derek had looked through our house like he was appraising merchandise. The way Brenda had smiled when she told me I had 2 hours to pack my life. The way Patricia had stood silent, arms crossed like a judge pronouncing sentence. They thought they had won. They thought the grieving widow would disappear quietly. grateful for whatever scraps they might throw her way. They had no idea that Richard Williams, the man they thought they knew so well, had left them one final lesson about underestimating the people you claim to love. I fingered that small key in my pocket and smiled for the first time in weeks. Tomorrow morning I would visit First National Bank. And then the real education would begin. But first, I had to let them enjoy their victory a little longer. After all, the higher they climbed, the harder they would fall. And something told me Richard had made sure that fall would be spectacular. The next morning came too early and too bright. I had barely slept, my mind racing between grief for Richard and fury at his family. But as I sat in that sterile hotel room, sipping bitter coffee from a paper cup, something crystallized inside me. I wasn't going to run away with my tail between my legs. I wasn't going to let them rewrite the story of my marriage or reduce me to a footnote in Richard's life. At 9 o'clock sharp, I walked into First National Bank. My hands trembled slightly as I approached the safety deposit box area, but my voice was steady when I handed over the key and my identification. The young bank employee, probably someone's granddaughter, smiled sympathetically when she saw my black dress. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Williams," she said softly as she led me to the private viewing room. Box 247 was larger than I had expected. When the employee left me alone and I lifted the lid, my breath caught in my throat. Inside were documents I had never seen before, carefully organized in manila folders with Richard's meticulous handwriting labeling each one. The first folder made my heart skip. Last Will and Testament, final version, September 2023. This was dated just 6 weeks before Richard died, which meant there was a will much more recent than anything his family knew about. My hands shook as I opened it and began to read. What I found there made me sink into the chair behind me. Richard hadn't just left me the house, he had left me everything. The house, the investment accounts, the life insurance, even his classic car collection that Derek had always assumed would be his. But that wasn't the most shocking part. The most shocking part was the conditions he had attached to Derek's inheritance. According to the will, Derek would receive a substantial trust fund, but only if he could prove he had held steady employment for 2 consecutive years and completed a financial responsibility course. Until then, he would receive exactly $500 a month. Enough for rent and groceries, Richard had written in the margins, but not enough for his usual lifestyle. Brenda and Patricia were mentioned too, but not in the way they expected. Each was to receive a modest sum, $10,000, along with a letter Richard had written to each of them. Those letters were in the box too, sealed envelopes with their names written in Richard's careful script. But there was more. So much more. The second folder contained documentation of something that made my blood run cold, a detailed record of Derek's financial manipulation over the years. Richard had kept track of every loan that was never repaid, every sob story, every time Derek had taken advantage of his father's love. The total came to over $200,000. Richard had also documented Brenda's attempts to influence his financial decisions, including recorded phone conversations where she suggested he should think about the future and consider what would happen to the family money if something happened to Grace. I had never known about these calls, but Richard had been recording them for months. The third folder, the Kai, was perhaps the most devastating. Copies of emails and text messages between Derek, Brenda, and Patricia from the past year. They had been planning this takeover long before Richard died. They had discussed how to handle the Grace situation and had even consulted a lawyer about contesting any will. That left me significant assets. The old man is too sentimental about her, Derek had written to his Aunt Patricia. But blood is thicker than water. We just need to make sure he remembers that before it's too late. Patricia had responded, "Don't worry. I've been working on him. Grace has had a good run, but she needs to understand her place in the family hierarchy." Reading those words felt like being slapped. These people I had cooked for, hosted, listened to, worried about, they had been plotting against me while I was caring for my dying husband. They had been planning to erase me from Richard's life before his body was even cold. But the final folder was Richard's masterstroke. Inside was a letter addressed to me, along with contact information for a lawyer I had never heard of, someone Richard had hired secretly to handle his affairs. The letter was classic Richard, methodical, loving, and brilliant. My dearest Grace, it began. If you are reading this, it means they have shown you exactly who they are. I hope it wasn't too painful, but I knew it was necessary for you to see the truth before you could understand what needs to be done. He went on to explain that he had expected his family's behavior. He had even counted on it. The will I had just read was legal and binding, but he had deliberately left another document with his old lawyer, an outdated will that left Derek the bulk of the estate. His family would find that will and assume they had won. Let them celebrate, Richard had written. Let them show their true colors completely. Let Derek quit whatever job he might have and start spending money he doesn't actually have. Let Brenda make plans for my house. Let Patricia start counting money that isn't coming to her. And then, when they have fully revealed themselves, when they have made their intentions completely clear, you will present the real will. The genius of it took my breath away. Richard had set a trap, and his family was walking right into it. At the bottom of the letter, he had written something that made tears stream down my face. You have been the best part of my life for 52 years, Grace. You deserve so much more than I could ever give you, but I can at least give you the satisfaction of watching them learn what happens when you underestimate the wrong woman. I sat in that bank vault for nearly an hour reading and rereading everything. Richard had given me more than an inheritance. He had given me the tools for justice. Not just legal justice, but poetic justice. He had seen exactly how this would play out, and he had made sure I would be ready. When I finally left the bank, the box locked away again, and copies of everything tucked safely in my purse, I felt like a different person than the broken widow who had walked in. I felt dangerous. I felt powerful. I felt like the woman Richard had always seen in me, even when I couldn't see her myself. But I also knew I had to be smart about this. Richard's plan was brilliant, but it required patience. I had to let his family continue thinking they had won. I had to let them dig themselves deeper into their own grave. The question was, how long could I stand to watch them celebrate while I grieved alone? How long could I let them enjoy what they thought? Was there victory before I pulled the rug out from under them? As I drove away from the bank, I realized the answer was simple. I would wait exactly as long as it took for them to prove, beyond any shadow of a doubt, who they really were. And something told me that wouldn't take very long at all. The waiting was the hardest part. For 3 weeks, I stayed in that cramped hotel room, watching from the sidelines as Richard's family made themselves at home in my life. Through friends who still lived in the neighborhood, I heard the updates that made my blood boil. Derek had quit his job at the NAI insurance company, the first steady employment he'd had in 2 years. No point in working for peanuts when I'm about to inherit Dad's estate, he had told his manager, according to Betty Morrison, who worked in the same building and attended my church. Brenda had moved into the master bedroom, my bedroom, and had started redecorating. She'd thrown away the curtains I had sewn by hand and painted over the soft blue walls Richard and I had chosen together. According to my neighbor, Mrs. Chen, who stopped by to check on things, Brenda was telling everyone that Grace had finally moved on to something more suitable for a woman her age. But Patricia was the worst of all. She had taken over Richard's study and was going through his papers like a general planning a campaign. She had even called Richard's old lawyer to schedule a reading of the will, expecting to walk away with the lion's share of everything. Every piece of news felt like a knife twist, but I forced myself to remember Richard's words. Let them show their true colors completely. And that's exactly what they were doing. Meanwhile, I was busy with preparations of my own. I met with Thomas Hendricks, the lawyer Richard had hired secretly. He was a sharp man in his 60s who specialized in estate law and had a reputation for being absolutely ruthless when his clients were wronged. Your husband was very thorough, Thomas told me during our first meeting, reviewing the documents from the safety deposit box. He documented everything meticulously. When we present this evidence, there won't be any room for dispute. But Thomas also helped me understand something crucial. Timing would be everything. We need to let them file probate on the old will, he explained. Let them go through the legal process. Let them make their claims public. The more committed they become to their version of events, the more devastating the reversal will be. He also helped me understand the full scope of what Richard had done. The outdated will that Derek would inherit wasn't just a decoy, it was a test Richard had built. Richard had in provisions that would reveal exactly what his son's priorities were. According to the fake will, Derek's inheritance came with one condition. He had to take care of me. He was required to provide me with housing and a monthly stipend for the rest of my life. It was a test of character, and based on what I had seen so far, Derek was failing spectacularly. During those weeks of waiting, I also did something I hadn't done in years. I started taking care of myself. I bought new clothes that made me feel strong instead of invisible. I got my hair styled in a way that made me look confident instead of merely neat. I began seeing a grief counselor who helped me understand that mourning Richard and fighting for justice weren't contradictory. They were both acts of love. I also started keeping a detailed journal of everything Richard's family was doing. Every conversation reported by friends, every change they made to the house, every assumption they voiced about my future. I was building my own case, documenting their behavior just as carefully as Richard had documented theirs. Dr. Sarah Martinez, my counselor, helped me understand something important during one of our sessions. "Grace," she said, "you've spent 50 years trying to keep the peace in that family. You've absorbed their resentment, their passive aggression, their dismissal of your worth. This isn't just about money or property. This is about reclaiming your voice." She was right. This wasn't really about the inheritance, though that mattered. This was about 50 years of being treated like a second-class citizen in my own family. This was about every snide comment, every dismissive look, every time they had made me feel like I didn't belong. But the breakthrough moment came 4 weeks after I'd been kicked out when I received a phone call that changed everything. It was Derek, and he was drunk. "Grace," he slurred into the phone. "I wanted to call and tell you. No hard feelings, about the house and everything. Mom explained it to me. You understand, right? Family business stays in." The family. I stayed silent, letting him talk. "The thing is," he continued, "Dad left some provisions for you in the will. Not much, but enough. Problem is, I'm gonna need you to sign a waiver. Give up the monthly payments he wanted me to make. I've got some investments I want to make. You understand. Business opportunities. I can give you a lump sum instead, maybe $20,000. That should be enough to get you set up somewhere nice. $20,000. Instead of lifetime care, he was offering me $20,000 and calling it generous. If you're following my story and wondering how I managed to stay calm during that phone call, don't forget to subscribe because you're about to discover exactly how I used Derek's greed against him. "Derek," I said carefully, "that's very thoughtful of you, but I need to think about it. Can you give me the details in writing?" Sure, he said, clearly relieved that I wasn't arguing. "I'll have my lawyer draw something up. You'll see, Grace. This way is better for everyone." After I hung up, I sat in that hotel room and smiled for the first time in weeks. Derek had just handed me the final piece of evidence I needed. He wasn't just taking my home and dismissing my rights. He was trying to cheat me out of the provisions his father had supposedly made for me. Richard's plan was working perfectly. His family wasn't just showing their true colors. They were painting themselves into a corner they would never be able to escape. But I still had one more week to wait. One more week to let them think they had won completely. One more week to let them make the kinds of decisions that people make when they think no one is watching and no one can stop them. The hardest part was that I missed Richard terribly during those weeks. I missed having someone who understood what his family was really like. I missed having someone who saw my worth when they tried to make me invisible. But I also felt closer to him than I had since he died, because I was finally doing something he would have been proud of. I was finally fighting back, and the battle was about to begin. The day of reckoning came on a Tuesday in November, exactly 6 weeks after they had thrown me out of my own home. The probate hearing for Richard's official will was scheduled for 2 o'clock, and I had spent the morning preparing for what would either be the most satisfying moment of my life or a complete disaster. Thomas Hendricks had coached me carefully. "Let them present their case first," he had advised. "Let them get comfortable. Let them think they've won. Then we'll show them what a real will looks like." I arrived at the courthouse 30 minutes early, but I could see Derek's car already in the parking lot. Through the window, I watched him adjusting his tie and checking his reflection. He had bought a new suit for the occasion, probably the first new clothes he'd purchased with his own money in years. Inside the courthouse, the scene was exactly what I had expected. Derek sat at one table with a lawyer I didn't recognize, looking confident and proprietary. Brenda and Patricia flanked him like bookends, both dressed in their finest clothes and wearing expressions of barely concealed triumph. They had saved a seat for me in the gallery, like I was a guest at my own husband's estate hearing instead of his widow and primary beneficiary. The condescension was breathtaking, but I had learned to channel my anger into something more useful. Clarity. When the judge called the hearing to the order, Derek's lawyer stood first. He was a young man, probably fresh out of law school, and he delivered his presentation with the kind of confidence that comes from believing you're stating obvious facts. Your Honor, this is a straightforward case, he began. The deceased, Richard Williams, left a clear will dated March 2022, leaving the bulk of his estate to his biological son, Derek Williams, with provisions for his widow's care. Mrs. Grace Williams has been provided with the terms of that care and has indicated her willingness to accept a settlement in lieu of monthly payments. He went on to detail the terms of the old will, painting a picture of Richard as a responsible family man who had taken care of his wife while ensuring his legacy remained within his bloodline. It was a neat, clean narrative that made Derek look like a dutiful son and me like a well-provided-for widow. Derek himself took the stand to confirm that he intended to honor his father's wishes and take care of me, as Dad would have wanted. His performance was Oscar-worthy. He even managed to look emotional when he talked about his father's final wishes. My dad was a good man, Derek said, his voice catching slightly. He loved Grace, and he wanted to make sure she was taken care of. That's why he left instructions for me to provide for her. I want to honor that, but I also think a lump sum settlement would be better for everyone involved. More dignity for Grace, more flexibility for both of us. The result. Judge nodded along, clearly seeing this as a routine family matter. Derek's lawyer produced the settlement agreement, that $20,000 buyout Derek had mentioned on the phone, and presented it as evidence of the family's good intentions. As you can see, Your Honor, this is more than generous for a woman of Mrs. Williams' age and circumstances, the lawyer said. A woman of my age and circumstances, like I was some charity case instead of the widow of a successful businessman. Then it was my turn. I stood slowly, feeling every pair of eyes in that courtroom on me. I had dressed carefully for this moment, not in the submissive widow's weeds they expected, but in a sharp navy suit that made me look like someone to be taken seriously. Your Honor, I said, my voice steady and clear. I'm afraid there's been a mistake. Thomas Hendricks rose beside me, and I saw Derek's confident expression flicker for just a moment. My client has evidence that the will presented today is not, in fact, the last will and testament of Richard Williams, Thomas announced. The reaction was immediate. Derek's lawyer started to object, but Thomas was already presenting the real will to the judge. Derek himself had gone pale, and I could see Brenda and Patricia exchanging panicked glances behind him. This will is dated September 15th, 2023, Thomas continued. Just 6 weeks before Mr. Williams' death. It supersedes the document presented by the petitioner and tells a very different story about Mr. Williams's final wishes. The judge accepted the document and began reading. The silence in that courtroom was deafening. I could hear Derek's breathing become shallow, could see his hands trembling as he realized his world was about to collapse. But I wasn't done yet. Your Honor, I said, I'd also like to present evidence that the petitioner has acted in bad faith from the moment of his father's death. Thomas handed over copies of everything. The recorded phone conversations where Derek discussed cheating me out of my inheritance, the text messages where the family planned their takeover, the documentation of Derek quitting his job the moment he thought he was inheriting money, and the settlement agreement where he tried to buy me off for a fraction of what his father had actually left me. As the judge reviewed each piece of evidence, I watched 50 years of accumulated resentment and dismissal finally catch up with Richard's family. Derek's lawyer was frantically whispering in his ear, but there was nothing they could do. The evidence was overwhelming, the legal documents were ironclad, and their own behavior had sealed their fate. Mrs. Williams, the judge said finally, looking directly at me, according to this will, you are the primary beneficiary of your husband's estate. The house, the investments, the life insurance, everything passes to you. I nodded calmly, as if this was exactly what I had expected all along. Furthermore, the judge continued. The evidence presented suggests that the petitioner has misrepresented the deceased's intentions and has attempted to defraud the primary beneficiary. This court finds no validity in the claims presented by Derek Williams. The gavel came down like thunder, but I still wasn't finished. Derek and his lawyer scrambled to understand what had just happened. As Brenda sat in stunned silence, as Patricia's face turned the color of old porcelain, I stood and delivered the speech I had been rehearsing for weeks. "Derek," I said, turning to face him directly, "your father left you a way to earn your inheritance. All you had to do was take care of me and prove you could hold a job. Instead, you quit your work, threw me out of my home, and tried to cheat me out of what little you thought I was owed." Derek's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "Brenda," I continued, "you spent 50 years treating me like I didn't belong in this family. You can spend the rest of your life wondering what might have been different if you had chosen kindness instead of cruelty." I turned to Patricia last. "And you, Patricia. You taught Richard's family that blood was more important than love, that genetics mattered more than character. I hope you enjoy the $10,000 Richard left you, because it's the last penny of his money you'll ever see." As I walked out of that courtroom, my heels clicking on the marble floor, I heard Derek's voice behind me, desperate and pleading. "Grace, wait! We can work this out! It doesn't have to be like this." But it was too late for that. 50 years too late. I had won more than a legal battle that day. I had reclaimed my voice, my dignity, and my future. And for the first time since Richard died, I felt like I could breathe again. 6 months later, I stood in the garden behind my house, watching the spring flowers Richard and I had planted together bloom in the warm April sunshine. The roses were particularly beautiful this year, as if they had been waiting for the chaos to settle before showing their true colors. The house felt different now. Not just because Brenda's ugly decorating choices had been erased and my own touches restored, but because the weight of other people's resentment no longer pressed down on every room. For the first time in decades, this felt like my space instead of territory I was graciously allowed to occupy. The legal aftermath had been swift and decisive. Derek's attempt to contest the real will had been thrown out of court within a week. His lawyer, the same young man who had been so confident during that first hearing, had advised him to accept the $500. A month Richard had allocated for him and be grateful for it. Derek had struggled with that advice. The monthly payments were contingent on him maintaining steady employment and staying out of debt, conditions that proved nearly impossible for a man who had spent 48 years believing this world owed him a living. Last I heard, he was working at a car dealership and living in a studio apartment, learning for the first time in his life what it meant to budget. Brenda had taken the revelation even harder. The discovery that Richard had been recording her manipulative phone calls had shattered her illusion of herself as the caring sister looking out for the family's best interests. She had moved back to Ohio to live with her daughter, taking the $10,000 Richard had left her, and the knowledge that her brother had seen through her act completely. Patricia had simply disappeared. After the hearing, she had cleaned out her apartment and moved to Arizona without leaving a forwarding address. The $10,000 Richard had left her had bounced back to the estate, unclaimed. Perhaps she was too proud to accept what she saw as charity, or perhaps she was too ashamed to take money from the man whose judgment she had so thoroughly misunderstood. But the most profound change wasn't in their lives. It was in mine. For 50 years, I had lived as a supporting character in other people's stories. I had been Richard's wife, Derek's stepmother, the Williams family's quiet addition. I had absorbed their moods, anticipated their needs, and shaped myself around their expectations until I had almost forgotten who I was underneath all those roles. Richard's final gift hadn't just been financial security. It had been permission to be myself again. The woman who had fallen in love with a kind man and built a beautiful life with him. The woman who deserved respect and consideration. The woman who had every right to take up space in the world. I had started taking art classes at the community college, something I had always wanted to do but never felt I had time for. I discovered I had a talent for watercolors, particularly landscapes and garden scenes. My instructor, a woman about my age who had started painting after her own life-changing moment, encouraged me to enter a local art show. "Grace," she said one afternoon as we packed up our supplies, "you paint like someone who has finally learned to see clearly." She was right. Everything looked different now, sharper, more vivid, more real. Colors I had been blind to for years now demanded my attention. Beauty I had been too tired to notice now filled my days. I had also started volunteering at a legal aid clinic, helping other women navigate estate issues and family disputes. So many of them reminded me of myself 6 months earlier, invisible, dismissed, convinced they had no options. I shared my story carefully, strategically, showing them that being underestimated could be an advantage if you were smart about it. The most dangerous woman, I would tell them, is the one people think is harmless. My friendship with Thomas Hendricks had evolved too. What had started as a professional relationship had become something more personal, not romantic, but a deep mutual respect between two people who understood the value of justice. He had started referring other cases to me, women whose husbands' families were trying to erase them from wills and inheritance plans. "You have a gift for this," he told me after I helped a 70-year-old woman reclaim her late husband's pension from his grasping children. "You understand what they're going through in a way I never could." But the most important relationship I had rebuilt was with myself. I had spent decades believing that keeping the peace was more important than speaking the truth, that being liked was more valuable than being respected. I had swallowed so many small humiliations, absorbed so many casual cruelties, that I had almost forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight and speak with my own voice. Richard's plan had given me more than revenge. It had given me back my spine. The woman who had stood in that courtroom 6 months ago, facing down a family that had tried to erase her, was not the same woman who had been thrown out of her house with 2 hours to pack her life. That woman had been broken, confused, overwhelmed by grief and shock. The woman I had become was calm, clear-eyed, and completely unafraid. On quiet evenings, I would sit on the porch where Richard and I had shared so many conversations, and I would talk to him about my day. I told him about the art classes, about the women I was helping, about the garden coming back to life. I told him about the peace I felt, the sense of rightness that had settled into my bones. "You knew," I would say to the evening air. "You knew exactly what I needed to become whole again." Because that's what this had been about, ultimately. Not money, not property, not even justice, though all of those mattered. It had been about reclaiming my wholeness, my sense of myself as someone who mattered, someone whose voice deserved to be heard. I had learned that being kind didn't mean being weak, that being patient didn't mean being passive, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone else's cruelty. To any woman reading this who feels invisible, dismissed, or taken for granted, you are not powerless. You are not too old to start over. You are not too tired to fight for what's yours. The world will try to convince you that your time has passed, that you should be grateful for whatever scraps you're offered, that making waves is unbecoming for someone your age. Don't believe them. You have lived long enough to know the difference between genuine kindness and manipulation. You have survived enough to trust your instincts about people's true intentions. You have earned the right to take up space, to speak your truth, to demand the respect you deserve. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give yourself is the courage to stop being nice to people who aren't nice to you. If my story has inspired you, or if you know someone who needs to hear it, please subscribe and share it. Because stories like mine need to be told, not to encourage bitterness or revenge, but to remind women everywhere that we are never too old to reclaim our power, our voice, and our lives. The roses in my garden are blooming again this spring, more beautiful than ever. Just like me. Tentar. Novamente,